Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I just want to begin, because it's relevant to part two, by just reflecting briefly on the contribution made by Marama Fox, because she finished her speech by saying that until now there had been no way of monitoring, for instance, child sex offenders or sex offenders who were deported back to New Zealand. That is actually not the case. And the Minister knows, because she was the Minister who ushered, who was in the role of Minister of Justice when this piece of legislation came through. And that is the Parole Extended Supervision Orders Amendment Bill. Now, the interesting thing about this bill, which demonstrates that actually we're not being contradictory when Labor on the one hand says that this bill should have had due consideration because it could have gone through earlier, the point is made by the Extended Supervision Bill, because this bill progressed. It began its life in April 2014 when we still didn't have our information sharing arrangement with Australia. We knew, however, that that was on the cards. The Minister was working hard to try and get officials and counterparts on board. And that piece of legislation, and this is relevant to part two because it talks about the similar regime is being used here as is being used in part two. And there it talks about the meaning of an eligible offender, and this language will be familiar. It says there that a person who is eligible has arrived in New Zealand within 6 months, again that 6-month timeline, of ceasing to be subject to any sentence or supervision conditions or order imposed on the person for a relevant offence by an overseas court, and has since that arrival been in New Zealand for less than 6 months and resides or intends to reside in New Zealand. That's the criteria for an extended supervision order to apply to someone who has committed an offence at a high enough level. Now, we know that we already have offenders who fulfil that criteria. Now, this is relevant because in part two we're covering them off again. There is a definition in there which allows for someone who's committed a serious offence to be covered by this bill, but we already have a regime. And we know that since 2013, there's been approximately 70% of returning offenders have been convicted overseas for serious offences. Assault, 30%, armed robbery or burglary, 20%, rape or sexual assault, including child sex offenders, 15%, murder and manslaughter, 5%. And yet, it's my understanding that extended supervision orders have not been used once. That is my understanding. Now, I'd be very interested to hear from the Minister why that is the case. And the reason I'd be interested in hearing that is because in part two, we have two regimes set out. One is a default regime. The other is a regime that must be triggered through an application through the courts by corrections. Now, if we already have a regime like that set out through the extended supervision orders, but it hasn't been used, why is that? Was the threshold test not met? Were corrections not spry enough to make the applications? Was the definition of the offenders captured incorrect? This is really critical information, because if there has been some kind of drafting error in the extended supervision orders, given it mirrors what we're doing in part two, we need to know that. Why has it not been used? Well, you need to also know it because the Corrections Department play a critical role in enacting part of this part two. Now, let's go through this, Mr. Chair, because I want to just explore potentially whether there might be two gaps where we're exposed by the two definitions in part two of who is covered under this legislation. Under clause 17, we have the criteria for determination that a person is a returning prisoner. Keeping in mind that the definition applies, we have a returning prisoner and we have a returning offender. One is more immediate than the other. The returning prisoner, the Commissioner must determine that a person is a returning prisoner if the Commissioner is satisfied that the person has, and as we've traversed already, been convicted of a relevant offence of 1 year or more and is returning within 6 months. Important point here, and I want the Minister to confirm whether or not I'm correct. If they come back to New Zealand and an order is not issued, a determination notice is not issued within 6 months of that return, is it correct that that opportunity is completely lost for any kind of monitoring regime? So they could fulfil the criteria for a determination order as set out in part two, but if they drop the ball, if for some reason a determination notice is not offered, Mr. Chair, if there is no opportunity for a determination notice to be issued in writing, then that opportunity is lost. Now, the reason I raise that is because in clause 19 it sets out that a commissioner must serve a written notice on a person. We're now calling them P. I don't know if this is a new drafting thing, but for the rest of them they're just called P. I find that confusing in the criminal world. There's another reference for P, but that means person. So if I read out P, it means person. The commissioner must serve a written notice on a person, brackets P, who is being determined to be a returning prisoner. It must be served, if practicable, on their return. If the service on P's return to New Zealand is not practicable, as soon as reasonably practicable, in any event not later than 6 months after their return to New Zealand. I know that we have difficulty serving protection orders in this country. It's a massive task, and the police don't even always do that job, even if we know that they've committed, that the person that the order needs to be served on has committed assault on a victim. The police then aren't always the ones who are serving the notice. So how do we know who is serving these notices? Who is serving them? Is it the police? Because I am very sceptical of their ability to make sure that every single person who's covered in this bill will be able to be found in a practicable time by police. I'd be interested in clarification. Who's doing that job? Because if it doesn't happen in 6 months, essentially, if someone arrives and disappears and we don't find them in 6 months, game over, no matter how serious their offence. And it's a point I want to make to this House. This bill is not based on the seriousness of offence. It's not. That is not what determines whether or not you will be covered by monitoring conditions. What is determined is whether and how quickly you are deported after you're released. That's what determines whether you'll be monitored. Now, that seems to be a flaw in the principle of what we're trying to do here. For instance, someone who's had low-level offending, they're in prison for a year or more though, they come out, they're detained straight away in a facility for 6 months, brought back to New Zealand, they'll be monitored. By default, they will be monitored. Someone, however, who, for instance, might be on a life sentence but has been free in Australia for 6 months isn't covered by default. If they come back into New Zealand, we're then, Mr. Chair, reliant on the next definition. I'll find it in the bill. The next definition, which is the returning offender who returns to New Zealand more than 6 months after release from custody. Now, for these offenders, we are absolutely reliant on the court imposing conditions on that returning offender, as set out in this bill. So again, that's reliant on the application of the Chief Executive to impose any conditions on a returning offender to whom the subpart applies, and the subpart, of course, being the definition around them having spent 6 months or more free, but having some conditions opposed to them. And again, that happens if you've got a serious offence. So this seems to be a big hole. The default stuff seems to potentially cover lower level, but potentially the more immediate. But we're reliant on corrections being spry for those areas where they might have a set of conditions that are being imposed by Australia that probably should continue to be imposed here. Now, I come back to my original point. If we are to have faith in corrections being able to do that sufficiently, why, when we know the seriousness of offenders that have already found themselves in New Zealand, we still haven't used extended supervision orders? Does that demonstrate that we shouldn't have faith in corrections that they're necessarily going to apply this subsection correctly and in a timely manner? So that's my concern. We've merged together two definitions around who's been captured, and we may end up being more punitive to the lower level offenders than we necessarily might be on those who might have a wider set of conditions. Now, I accept that the Minister, I think, has identified this issue herself with the new clause, I think that was 27A, which reverses the onus that the court basically, for a certain level of offending, has to impose conditions. But that actually was about making sure that where we had incomplete information, we were doing something quickly and effectively. But, Mr. Speaker, I have concerns that we are leaving too much up to officials who have already demonstrated to us that they are stretched and may not apply their discretion appropriately.
I've gone to